In September 1552, an unprecedented threat loomed over the castle of Eger, its weathered walls standing as a fragile bulwark. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers had surrounded the small fortress in northern Hungary, poised for a siege. Captain István Dobó knew the exact number of his men. He had a mere 2,000 at his disposal. Warriors, yes, but also old men, untrained peasants, women and children. No reinforcements were expected. No relief army was on the horizon. King Ferdinand in Vienna sent letters promising aid, but these promises were mere ink on paper. Faced with a 2-0-1 numerical disadvantage, any sane commander would consider surrender. Yet, Dobó understood something crucial. If Eger fell, all of northern Hungary would collapse like dominoes. The silver and gold mines of Kassa would fall into Ottoman hands, and the path to Vienna would be open. Europe itself would be changed forever. The question wasn't whether they could win, but how 2,000 people would turn the impossible into a reality. Before we continue, leave your location and time in the comments below to see how wide our audience is. And here is the question you'll need to answer by the end of this video. Was the victory at Eger a miracle, a stroke of luck, or the result of brilliant defensive strategy, unseen before in the world? To understand this, we must go back to 1526, to a battle that irrevocably altered Hungary's fate. On the 29th of August, 1526, on the field of Mohács, something happened that killed the Kingdom of Hungary, not metaphorically, but literally. Blood and bone, irrevocably. In under 2 hours, the Hungarian army was utterly annihilated by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. 20,000 Hungarians lay dead on the battlefield. King Louis II, a mere 20 years old, drowned in a swamp trying to escape in his heavy armor. But the true catastrophe wasn't the defeat, but what followed. Without a clear heir, Hungary descended into civil war. Two factions, Ferdinand of Habsburg and Jan of Zápolya, fought for the crown. While they squabbled for power, Suleiman acted. In 1541, Buda, Hungary's 1,000-year capital, fell, not through battle, but through deception. The Ottomans invited Hungarian leaders for peace talks, then took them hostage. The city fell without a fight. A painful lesson. Sometimes wars are won not by swords, but by betraying trust. By this time, Hungary had ceased to be a unified state. It was torn into 3 pieces, like ripped paper. The northwestern part went to the Habsburgs. The central region, including Buda, became Ottoman territory. The eastern part, Transylvania, became a puppet state, paying tribute to Istanbul but maintaining the illusion of autonomy. This was not just a territorial division, it was an operation to remove the nation's soul. For onbeer years, from 1540 to 1550, the Ottomans consolidated their control. Timișoara fell in July 1550. Szolnok surrendered without a fight when its garrison simply fled at the sight of the massive Ottoman army. Another 25 Hungarian fortresses crumbled like chess pieces. By September 1552, the Ottoman summer campaign had been a resounding success. Only one obstacle remained between them and the complete conquest of northern Hungary, Eger Castle. Why was Eger so significant? At first glance, it's just a small fortress in the hills. But look at a 15th century map. Eger was situated in a strategically vital location. To the north lay Kassa, the center of silver and gold mining, a huge source of revenue for the kingdom. To the west, a road led to Vienna. If Eger fell, the Ottomans would not only gain wealth, they would have an ideal logistical route to attack the heart of Europe. Qasim Ahmed Pasha, the Sultan's second vizier, understood this perfectly. He had crushed every fortress on his path north. Veszprém, Gergely, Szigedvár, all fell. He commanded 40,000 elite troops from Rumelia and Anatolia. He had 16 enormous cannons, zarbazans, capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. He had 150 smaller artillery pieces. He even had 2,000 camels to transport timber for siege engines. And on the other side, standing on the walls of Eger, Captain István Dobó had 2,000 men. The siege would last 39 days. What happened in those 39 days would become legend. But was it miracle or mastery? Keep watching to find out. Let me clarify something. István Dobó was not a military genius. He was not a legendary hero born for conquest. He was merely a minor nobleman, born around 1500. who grew up in a fractured Hungary and chose to side with the Habsburgs in the power struggle after Mohács. But one thing set Dobó apart. He was a man who prepared in advance. When he was appointed commander of Eger Castle in 1549, Dobó didn't celebrate. He looked at the crumbling walls and understood the brutal truth. The Ottomans would come, not may come, but would come, and when they appeared, no one would save Eger but those who defended it. From 1549 to 1552, Dobó labored tirelessly. He wasn't the type to shout from ramparts or inspire with fiery speeches. He was the man who recounted every bag of wheat in the storehouse, checked every cannon, knowing exactly how much gunpowder would be needed for a 30 or 50-day siege. He hired 6 German gunners, not out of wealth, but because he understood that in modern warfare, technology was more important than bravery. He built wooden fortifications at Szolnok, 100 kilometers to the south, creating an additional defensive line. When Szolnok fell in 1552, he didn't despair. He learned from its failure. However, Dobó's most crucial decision involved not weapons or walls, but people. News of the approaching massive Ottoman army had spread panic among the villagers surrounding Eger. They fled, not from the region, but into the castle. Hundreds of people, men, women, and children, streamed into Eger seeking refuge. Any other commander would have turned them away, as feeding more mouths during a siege seemed madness. Dobó thought differently. He threw open the gates and welcomed them. Why? Because he saw them not as a burden, but as a resource. Every pair of hands could carry stones. Every woman could boil water. Every child could carry messages. In defensive warfare, there are no useless people. There are only those for whom a suitable task has yet to be found. And there was one young man Dobó particularly trusted. Gergely Bornemissza. Bornemissza was 26 years old in 1552. He was an educated Lutheran, seemingly ill-suited for military service. He possessed a rare talent. He understood explosives, not just how to use them, but their chemistry, their mechanics, how to turn gunpowder into weapons the enemy had never seen. Dobó gave Bornemissza command of 250 infantrymen. But more importantly, he gave Bornemissza the freedom to experiment, create, and invent. This decision saved Eger. In early September 1552, as scouts reported the approach of the Ottoman army, 40,000 men, 16 huge cannons, 150 artillery pieces, Dobó gathered everyone in the castle. It wasn't an inspiring speech. It was an honest offer. According to Géza Gardini's novel Eclipse of the Crescent Moon, based on historical accounts, Dobó said, "For those who care more about their own skin than the fate of the nation, the door is still open. I need men, better a few lions than many rabbits. Let those who tremble at the coming storm leave before I say anything else. For we must swear to defend this castle. If anyone breaks that oath, he will not face God after death." No one left, not because they weren't afraid, but because Dobó had given them something more important than hope of victory. He had given them a reason to fight. On the 9th of September 1552, the Ottomans arrived, and the most brutal 39 days in Hungarian history began. To understand what happened next, one must grasp the Ottoman chain of command and its fatal flaw. Qasim Ahmed Pasha was the senior commander, leading 2/3 of the forces, about 27,000 men, but Ali Pasha of Buda possessed the real strategic talent. Ali understood artillery. He had only 4 large cannons under his direct command, but he positioned them perfectly, firing with deadly accuracy at the weakest points of the wall. Ahmed and Ali disliked each other. They competed over tactics, over glory, over who would receive credit when Eger fell. But Dobó watched this from the walls and realized this was the enemy's first weakness. The first week, nothing happened, and this was the most terrifying part. The Ottomans were not rushing into an attack. They set up camp, dug trenches, and methodically prepared their siege works. Ahmed Pasha was not impulsive. He had seen too many sieges fail due to attacking too early. He wanted to do things right. But this methodical approach gave Dobó time. Time to organize the defense. Time to assign roles. Time to turn frightened civilians into an organized defensive force. Had divided the castle into sectors, each led by a trusted officer, Gáspár Néptó, Gergely Bornemissza, István Dobó, and János Vigvári. Each was responsible for his section of the wall. Each knew that if their section fell, the entire castle would fall. The women were organized into teams, Some were constantly boiling water in huge cauldrons, others preparing bandages and dressing wounds, a third group ferrying ammunition and stones to the walls. The castle became a single organism. Each part supported all the others. On September 16, after a week of tense waiting, the bombardment began. Just imagine the sound. 16 Zarbazans and 150 smaller cannons firing simultaneously. Stone balls, each heavier than a grown man, flew through the air with terrifying speed, smashing into stone, wood, flesh. Explosions echoed like perpetual thunder. Dust covered everything. People couldn't hear, breathe, or think. For 12 days, from September 17 to 28, the bombardment never ceased. Nearly 12,000 cannonballs rained down on Eger, but those that didn't penetrate remained lodged in the walls, silent testaments to the destructive force the defenders faced. The bastions suffered serious damage. Critical damage was dealt to the outer wall, defended by officers including Bornemissza, Zoldos, and Vigvari. Cracks appeared. Stone fragments broke off. In some places, the walls began to crumble. But while cannons roared above ground, a different battle raged below. Both sides were familiar with the technique of mining. Tunnels were dug under the enemy walls, shored up with timber, and then the supports were set on fire to collapse everything from above. The Ottoman sappers began digging from their trenches, slowly advancing towards Eger's foundations. But they didn't know one thing. Eger was built on the ruins of an ancient stone fortress, which in turn replaced an even older earthwork, possibly built by the Huns, and Eger's foundations were stronger than any fortress the Ottomans had ever besieged. The stone here was not just hard, it was thick, deep, almost impenetrable. And Dobó had men who could listen. Hungarian miners put their ears to the ground, heard the digging below, then burrowed out to meet them, intercepting the tunnels. They met underground in hand-to-hand combat in total darkness, fighting with daggers and bare hands, never seeing each other's faces. Every Ottoman mining attempt failed. This deserves emphasis because it demonstrates Dobó's strategic thinking. He didn't just prepare weapons and food, he prepared for every type of attack the Ottomans might use. Mining was a standard Ottoman siege tactic, so Dobó prepared counter-mining. Artillery bombardment was expected, so he stockpiled stones from destroyed walls to throw back. Assault ladders were inevitable, so he organized teams to pour boiling substances. This is what set Dobó apart from other commanders. He didn't hope for the best. He prepared for everything, and then prepared for the worst. On September 29, Michael's Day, Ahmed Pasha decided enough was enough. 12 days of bombardment, the walls heavily damaged. It was time for a general assault. What happened next was one of the most brutal battles of the 15th century. The Ottomans attacked simultaneously from multiple directions. Thousands of janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, rushed the assault ladders. They did not fear death. Trained from youth to see death in battle as the highest honor, they shouted Allahu Akbar and advanced like an unstoppable wave. But they did not expect what awaited them at the top. Gergely Bornemissza had spent 2 weeks creating weapons the Ottomans had never encountered. Primitive grenades, clay pots filled with gunpowder, nails, scrap metal with burning fuses, barrel-sized bombs, large enough to blow up 10 men at once. And his most insane invention, a massive mill wheel packed with gunpowder and nails, ignited, then rolled down the hill into the tightly packed ranks of Ottomans. The scene must have been horrific, a giant flaming wheel, rolling down the hill with increasing speed, exploding amidst a mass of men climbing ladders. Those nearby were shredded by shrapnel, others crushed by the wheel itself. Panic spread like wildfire. But that wasn't all. As the Ottomans reached the tops of the ladders, they encountered the women of Eger. History tends to exaggerate the role of women in warfare, but at Eger, their role was real. Not because they fought with swords, although the famous painting by Bertalan Sekli depicts this, but because they turned everyday objects into weapons. Boiling water from cauldrons, molten pitch from barrels, red-hot lead from smelting crucibles, stones from the ruined walls. The women poured, threw, pushed all of it down the siege ladders. An Ottoman soldier would climb with hope, only to meet a woman at the top holding a bucket of boiling water. Then came the most agonizing death. Contemporary sources confirm this. Italian diplomat Girolamo Martinelli wrote of these scenes not as legend, but as brutal fact. The women of Eger, including Catalin Dobó, possibly a relative of the captain, actively participated in the defense, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. The battle on September 29 lasted all day. At one point, the Ottomans breached the Ox Gate, an old gate tower. Janissaries flooded in, took position, and began firing on the defenders from inside the castle. This was the moment most sieges end. Once the enemy is inside, all is lost. But Dobó didn't panic. He stood on the shrine bastion and ordered all the largest cannons to be aimed at the old gate tower, where Ottoman Hungarian soldiers were engaged in hand-to-hand combat. His officers objected. "Firing there will kill our own men," Dobó calmly replied. "Better to kill 10 of our men than lose the entire castle." The cannons fired. The tower collapsed, burying both Ottomans and Hungarians. But the position was reclaimed, and after a brutal melee amongst the rubble, the defenders actually pushed the Ottomans back and even advanced beyond the walls into their trenches, driving them back into their camps. The assault on September 29 failed. The Ottomans lost thousands, but they still had 30,000 soldiers, and they would attack again. This episode reveals perhaps Dobó's greatest leadership trait, his willingness to make extremely difficult decisions. Ordering fire on his own men is something that haunts commanders their entire lives. However, Dobó clearly understood one crucial detail of defensive tactics. Excessive emotion is fatal. At that moment, saving 10 soldiers meant losing 2,000. Losing the tower, they realized they were following a man willing to do anything for survival. Such a leader may not be adored, but he is trusted. And in war, trust is far more valuable. The psychological impact on the Ottoman troops cannot be overstated. They had thrown everything at Eger in the assault on St. Michael's Day. A full-scale attack, breaches at multiple points, overwhelming force, and it was all repulsed. They weren't just stopped. They were thrown back with massive losses. For an army accustomed to victory, accustomed to seeing one fortress fall after another, this was unthinkable. How did these men, outnumbered and outgunned, defending damaged walls, keep fighting? The answer the Ottomans couldn't comprehend was simple. The defenders of Eger knew exactly what they were fighting for. The Ottomans fought for the glory of the Sultan, for conquest, for the expansion of an empire. The people inside Eger fought for their children, their homes, for their very existence as a people. This difference between fighting for abstract glory and fighting for survival became an invisible wall the Ottomans could not overcome. October arrived, bringing with it unexpected changes. Autumn in Hungary usually arrives gradually, but in 1552, it descended with sudden fury. Temperatures plummeted, the ground froze, and then the rains came. Not just rain, but downpours, turning the earth into mud and soaking everything through. They seeped through the canvas of every tent. For the defenders, inside their stone castle, it was merely an inconvenience. But for the 40,000 Ottoman soldiers camped outside, mostly in canvas tents, it was a nightmare. Their uniforms remained constantly damp, food rotted and grew mold, but worse, disease began to spread. First, dysentery in the overcrowded military camps, where tens of thousands shared the same water sources and huddled in close quarters. Illness spread with alarming speed. Soldiers began to die, not from Hungarian swords, but from their own intestinal complaints. Day by day, the sick numbered not in the tens, but in the hundreds. However, supply issues proved even worse. The Ottomans had brought vast quantities of gunpowder and stone balls, but after 20 days of continuous bombardment, their reserves began to dwindle, and not by a small margin. Each stone ball had to be quarried from marble, a process that took hours. Production could not keep up with consumption. As a result, Ahmed Pasha's massive cannons fell silent for over a week, awaiting ammunition. The Ottomans' terrifying artillery advantage, their greatest strength, was paralyzed by a simple logistical failure. And then there was food. Rice rations became smaller, and rumors of corruption spread. Officers were allegedly selling food to soldiers for profit. Whether these rumors were true or not, they eroded morale. Soldiers didn't fear dying in battle, but they hated the idea of being cheated by their own commanders. In the Ottoman camp, the atmosphere shifted from confidence to doubt, then to despair. How many men had they already lost? 8,000? 10,000? And for what? To capture one small, insignificant castle? Meanwhile, Conditions inside Eger were not easy either. The defenders had lost an estimated 400 to 600 men, nearly a third of their initial fighting force. Each bastion now had fewer defenders. All were exhausted. They had fought all day and stood watch all night for 3 weeks straight. Sleep was a luxury. Food was running low. Gunpowder, though carefully stockpiled by Dobó, was not infinite, and everyone knew another major assault could break them. On October 11, that assault came. This time, Ahmed Pasha threw everything into the attack. No reserves, no sophisticated tactics, just brute force. Tens of thousands of soldiers attacked every point along the perimeter simultaneously, hoping to break through the defense somewhere. For 2 days, October 11 and 12, Eger endured hell. Ottomans climbed ladders from all sides at once. Bloody skirmishes erupted at every section of the wall. There was no safe place. All soldiers, civilians, women, even children old enough to carry stones, joined the battle. Bornemissza used his last grenades. Women poured their last buckets of boiling water. Cannons fired until their barrels became too hot to touch. But the Ottomans kept coming. Wave after wave, janissaries ascended the ladders. These were not conscripts or unwilling soldiers. These were professional warriors trained their entire lives for this. They stepped over the bodies of fallen comrades without hesitation. As one ladder was repelled, another was immediately placed in its stead. When boiling water took down a dozen men, another score immediately replaced them. On the northeast bastion, defenders ran out of stones to throw. They began dismantling their own fortifications to get more projectiles. At the south wall, women ran out of water to boil and began pouring boiling oil on the attackers. It was more dangerous, but far more devastating to the attackers. At the west gate, Bornemissa's last barrel bomb killed 30 Ottomans, but also damaged the gate itself, requiring desperate repairs. While the battle raged everywhere, the defense improvised. Planks from broken carts became shields. Broken pottery became projectiles. Even dirt from the ground was gathered and thrown in the faces of Ottomans to temporarily blind them. Any object, any substance, any desperate idea was turned into a weapon. This is what desperation looks like in battle. Not the cinematic desperation of heroic last stands in movies, but the grinding, exhausting, maddening desperation of people who have been fighting for weeks and know they cannot stop for a single moment. On October 13, after yet another failed assault, something shifted in the Ottoman camp. A terrifying silence fell, but it was not the silence of preparation, but of despair. Ottoman officers began openly arguing. Ahmed blamed Ali blamed Ahmed. Both blamed subordinate officers, who in turn blamed soldiers who no longer had the capacity to figure out who was at fault. This was not just tactical disagreement. It was a complete breakdown of command cohesion. When Ahmed ordered another attack, some units hesitated. When Ali positioned artillery, other commanders doubted if another bombardment would yield anything. The unified Ottoman war machine fractured into factions, and then, on October 17, rumors began to spread through the Ottoman camp, rumors destined to become legend. Turkish soldiers watching the Hungarians fight with seemingly superhuman strength began to tell each other stories. And they said the Hungarians drank bull's blood. That's why they were so strong. They had seen Hungarian beards dyed red with liquid during the battle. In reality, it was red wine. But the Muslim Ottoman soldiers, who did not consume alcohol, didn't know this. They said the Hungarian women were witches who could boil water with magic. They said the castle itself was enchanted, protected by ancient spirits. Of course, all of this was nonsense. But in war, truth matters less than what people believe. And when an army begins to believe it is fighting something supernatural, its will crumbles. This is what actually happened with the legend of Bull's Blood. The Hungarian defenders, exhausted and frightened after days of bombardment, needed something to maintain their morale. Dobó brought wine from the castle cellars, not to get drunk, but to give the frightened men a moment of courage. Medieval people believed wine had fortifying properties. Whether this was true medically is irrelevant. The psychological effect was important. Soldiers, trembling with fear, drank the wine and felt a warmth spread through their bodies. They felt strong again, for a moment. They returned to the walls with renewed energy. Ottoman observers, seeing this transformation and noticing the stains of red wine, created their own explanation: magical blood. But the real magic wasn't in the wine, it was in belief. The Hungarian defenders believed they could keep fighting, and they fought. The Ottoman attackers believed they were fighting something unnatural, so their confidence faltered. This reveals a profound truth about human psychology. In extreme situations, what we believe about our situation matters more than objective facts. The objective fact was that Eger's defenders were starving, exhausted, short on ammunition, and outnumbered 2-0-1, but they believed they could hold for one more day. And they did. And then, they believed they could hold for one more day, and they held again. Meanwhile, the objective fact for the Ottomans was that they still possessed overwhelming, but they believed they were fighting something invincible, so they began to break. On October 17, another massive assault followed. The Ottomans, with desperate fury, threw themselves at the walls. This was no longer about tactics, it was about emotion. Commanders who had lost thousands of men wanted something, anything, to show in justification of those deaths. Soldiers who had seen friends die craved revenge, and the assault was less about capturing Eger and more about not feeling like all previous deaths had been in vain. The fighting that day was the most brutal of the entire siege. Hand-to-hand combat on the walls. Soldiers wrestled and fell from the walls together. The defenders were so exhausted they could barely lift their weapons. The attackers were so frustrated they took unconscionable risks. At one point, part of the southern wall partially collapsed due to constant bombardment. For a moment, it seemed the Ottomans would finally break through. They surged towards the breach like water through a crack in a dam. However, Dobó was there, not giving orders from behind, but personally standing at the breach with his sword in hand. At 50 years old, when most men in the 15th century were considered elderly, he fought like a young warrior, not because he was particularly skilled with a sword. He wasn't, but because his presence meant far more than his combat prowess. When the defenders saw their commander standing at the breach, refusing to retreat, they found strength they never knew they possessed. They rallied around him, forming a living wall at the point of collapse. The breach turned into a slaughterhouse. So many Ottoman bodies accumulated that attackers had to climb over corpses to reach the defenders. The assault on October 17 continued from dawn until late at night. When it finally ended, both sides were so exhausted that soldiers simply collapsed where they stood. The defenders felt no triumph of victory, the attackers no organized retreat, only mutual exhaustion. That night, in the Ottoman command tent, Ahmed Pasha faced reality. His army had lost somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 men, possibly more. Casualty counts in 15th century warfare were highly inaccurate. Disease was spreading unchecked through the camp. Supplies were catastrophically low. Morale had evaporated, and the castle showed no signs of surrender. He had a choice: continue the siege into winter, watching his army slowly melt away from disease and desertion, or retreat now, while he still had an army to command. On the 18th of October 1552, Ahmed Pasha ordered a retreat. No final dramatic battle, no heroic gesture. The Ottomans simply packed up and left, leaving thousands of their dead buried in shallow graves around the castle. The exhausted Hungarian defenders stood on the walls and watched as the massive army slowly disappeared to the south. And then, as the last Ottoman finally vanished from sight, everyone in the castle began to realize they had survived. No one cheered with joy. They were too tired to celebrate. Some simply sat down right where they stood. Others wept, not from happiness, but from the release of 3 weeks of accumulated horror. 300 defenders had died. 200 were wounded. Many would never be able to fight again. The castle lay in ruins. Most bastions were badly damaged. Food was almost gone. Gunpowder was nearly depleted. If the Ottomans had returned after a week's rest, Eger would have fallen in a day. But they did not return. Not because they couldn't. They still had 30,000 soldiers. But because something in their spirit had broken, Eger had proven the Ottomans were not invincible. And once the myth of invincibility is shattered, it cannot be fully rebuilt. We must understand what was happening psychologically on both sides in these final days. Because the siege of Eger was ultimately decided not by weapons or tactics, it was decided by human endurance pushed to its absolute limit. Inside the castle, the defenders held on purely through willpower. Food was so strictly rationed that people were constantly hungry, though they didn't starve to death. Dobó's preparations prevented that. But it was a constant gnawing hunger that sapped strength and dulled minds. The lack of sleep was even worse. It's impossible to maintain 2 4-hour combat duty for weeks without dangerous levels of exhaustion. In such conditions, people begin to make mistakes. They mistake friend for foe, fall asleep at their posts, their reactions slow, making them vulnerable in combat. Dobó understood this danger, so he constantly rotated defenders, ensuring no one was on duty for more than a few hours at a time. But with only 2,000 men defending the entire perimeter of the castle, even rotations couldn't provide sufficient rest. The psychological toll was likely worse than the physical exhaustion. Imagine living under constant bombardment for a week. The sound of cannons never stops. Buildings collapse without warning. At any moment, a cannonball could crash through the roof and kill you in your sleep. Such prolonged stress breaks people, both visibly and invisibly. Some defenders developed what we would now call battle trauma, uncontrollable tremors, inability to speak, a vacant stare into space. In the 15th century, there were no terms for this. They simply called it battle-shocked. Dobó couldn't afford to send these men away. He needed every able-bodied warrior. So, the traumatized soldiers kept fighting, and their condition worsened with each passing day. The women defenders faced additional hardships. Many were mothers with children inside the castle. They fought on the walls, worrying about their children hiding in the cellars. Some were pregnant, continuing to carry stones and boil water, carrying unborn children. Historical records only briefly mention this, but try to imagine the full depth of these events. Heavily pregnant women climbing ladders with buckets of boiling water, knowing a single slip would mean death for both of them. Children experienced the siege in ways we can barely imagine. Medieval childhood was harsh enough. High infant mortality, food shortages, and dangerous living conditions. However, the siege added layers of unbearable trauma. Children witnessed the death of their parents. They watched bodies being torn apart by cannonballs. They heard screams that formed the fabric of nightmares. Some children were put to work, tasked with delivering messages or small supplies. Others hid in cellars, frightened and bewildered. Perhaps the elderly suffered the most. Unable to fight or do heavy labor, many felt useless. Yet, some insisted on participating, hobbling to the walls with fervor to throw stones, and dying of exhaustion in the attempt. Others quietly starved themselves, giving their rations to the younger defenders. These acts of self-sacrifice are rarely recorded in historical chronicles, but they were there. They always happened during sieges. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman camp, other, equally devastating, hardships arose. The Ottoman army was not a monolithic force. It was a coalition of various groups with differing motivations. The Janissaries fought for Suleiman the Magnificent and Islam. Their morale remained relatively high throughout the campaign, but the provincial troops from Anatolia and Rumelia were essentially conscripted peasants longing to return home. Mercenaries fought for money, and when payment became unreliable, as it always does in prolonged campaigns, their loyalty wavered. These differences in motivation led to cracks in the Ottoman camp. Janissaries disdained the provincial troops for their lack of fighting prowess. Provincial troops resented the Janissaries for their better equipment and provisions. Mercenaries disliked everyone, as they were dying for someone else's empire. The rivalry and misunderstanding between Ahmed and Ali Pasha only exacerbated the situation. Soldiers didn't know whose orders to follow when commanders contradicted each other. The logistical collapse accelerated this decay. When rice rations were cut, soldiers accused officers of corruption, sometimes justifiably. Stockpiling of food by officers while soldiers starved was common practice in medieval armies. Whether this happened at Eger is less important than the fact that soldiers believed it did. This belief poisoned morale more effectively than any Hungarian weapon. Diseases turned the Ottoman camp into a death trap. Dysentery kills slowly and painfully. Victims suffer for days from debilitating spasms, dehydration, and weakness. They become unable to fight, but not sick enough to be sent home. So they languished in tents, spreading infection to their comrades, creating ever-widening circles of illness throughout the camp. Without a modern understanding of sanitation, 15th century armies could not prevent the spread of disease. They didn't understand how to isolate sick soldiers. They didn't know that contaminated water sources caused dysentery. They couldn't grasp why disease erupted in some camps and not others. To them, illness seemed random, almost supernatural, making it even more psychologically destructive. By early October, The Ottoman camp likely held thousands of sick soldiers. While not always fatal, dysentery was debilitating. It presented commanders with a cruel choice: send the sick soldiers home, reducing the combat strength of the army, or keep them in camp, where they would infect others. Ahmed and Ali apparently chose the latter, indicating either strategic incompetence or a desperate unwillingness to admit the campaign's failure. The weather added another layer of suffering. October's cold in Hungary can be brutal. Nights with temperatures near freezing, winds that pierced through tents. Soldiers without adequate shelter developed hypothermia. Frostbite appeared on extremities. Respiratory illnesses spread. The combination of cold, disease, and malnutrition created a perfect storm of human suffering. In these conditions, the October 17 assault was no longer really about capturing Eger. It was about salvation. The Ottoman commanders knew they could not sustain the siege much longer. They needed a victory, any victory, to justify a retreat. A successful assault would mean they had captured Eger. A failed assault would prove Eger was unyielding regardless, and they could leave with some semblance of honor. But the assault failed, not in a small way, but decisively. The Ottomans threw everything they had at Eger, and they were utterly repulsed. This failure eliminated all options but a dishonorable retreat. On October 18, the decision to retreat likely brought immense relief to the common soldiers who had lived through 39 days of hell. But for commanders like Ahmed Pasha, retreat meant professional humiliation. He had commanded the second-largest Ottoman army of 1,552 and had failed to capture a small castle defended by 2,000 men. Such a failure spelled the end of a career. The retreat itself revealed the iron discipline of the Ottomans. Even in defeat, they did not panic or abandon equipment. Everything was methodically packed. They withdrew in good order, even burying their dead when possible. And while their morale was low, it was still a professional army capable of combat operations. However, it was defeated not so much by superior enemy forces as by its own limitations, logistical problems, disease, bad weather, and, most importantly, by the realization that some fortresses are impossible to take, no matter how many souls. For 39 days, they had expected death. Each morning brought new attacks. Each night was filled with the dread of what tomorrow would bring. And then, completely unexpectedly, inexplicably, the enemy left. The psychological shock must have been immense. From maximum stress to sudden relief, from constant mortal danger to relative safety, from utter hopelessness to unexpected salvation, many defenders likely experienced what we would now call shock. Emotional numbness, an inability to process what had happened, a disconnect from reality. But there was no time for processing trauma. The castle was in ruins. The walls needed immediate repair before the weather did more damage. Bodies needed to be buried to prevent the spread of disease. The wounded needed treatment. The children needed food. The harsh realities of life demanded attention, despite the psychological and physical exhaustion. This is what history often overlooks. Victory doesn't mean recovery. It means survival, followed by a massive amount of unglamorous, grueling work. Eger's glorious victory was immediately followed by weeks of cleaning bodies, repairing walls, treating infected wounds, and trying to restore some semblance of normal life. And hanging over it all was the thought no one wanted to voice, but everyone harbored. What if they come back? News of Eger spread across Europe with unprecedented speed. Battlefield reports were printed in Vienna, Prague, and Venice. People couldn't believe it. 2,000 men had defeated 40,000. How was this possible? King Ferdinand, who had refused to send reinforcements when Dobó pleaded for aid, now rushed to send rewards and honors. He granted Dobó the Transylvanian cities of Dava and Samosujvar. He appointed Dobó voivoda, essentially the ruler of all Transylvania, one of the most influential positions in the kingdom. Gergely Bornemissza received command of Eger Castle. At 26, he became one of the youngest and most respected generals in the Hungarian army. However, Bornemisza's story did not have a happy ending. In 1554, just 2 years after Eger, Bornemissza fell into an Ottoman ambush. He was captured alive and brought to Constantinople. The Ottomans knew his value. They offered him a deal. Reveal the secrets of Eger's defense, and you will be free, rich, and respected. Refuse, and you will die. Bornemissza refused. In 1556, he was hanged in Constantinople. He was 29 years old. Why? Why would a young man with his entire life ahead of him choose death over betrayal? This is a question each generation must answer for itself, but perhaps the answer lies in what Bornemissza experienced at Eger. He had seen what happened when people united for something larger than themselves. He had seen women pouring boiling water from the walls because they could not bear to let their children live under occupation. He had seen Dobó order fire on his own men to save the castle, and he understood that some things were more important than individual survival. When the Ottoman interrogators offered him his life in exchange for information, Bornemissza knew what his agreement would bring. Every future siege would use those secrets against Hungarian defenders. Every castle that fell because of his betrayal would be on his conscience. Every child enslaved, every woman captured, every man killed. All would be the result of his choice, choosing his own life at the expense of others. That is why he chose death, not because he wanted to die, but because he could not live as a man who betrayed everything Eger stood for. This choice was made alone in a Constantinople prison, with no witnesses to admire his bravery, and no guarantee that anyone would even know of his refusal. This is what true heroism looks like. It is not the heroism of the battlefield with glorious charges, but the quiet heroism of choosing principle over survival when no one is looking. Dobó's life after Eger was a political tragedy. In 1556, when Transylvanian magnates planned to break away from Habsburg rule, Dobó was imprisoned on suspicion of involvement. He was innocent and eventually released, but trust had been eroded. The man who saved Hungary was distrusted by the very people he had served. He died in 1,572 inches Sarid. He was 70 years old. He was largely forgotten. No grand funeral, no monument, just a humble tombstone marking the resting place of the man who saved a nation, and Eger itself. The castle was repaired and reinforced, but in 1596, 44 years after the great victory, Eger finally fell, and it did so not in the face of a massive army, but through betrayal. 7,000 defenders, largely composed of foreign mercenaries, surrendered to Sultan Mehmed II with almost no resistance. Why did this happen? The reason was that they lacked what those who defended the fortress in 1552 possessed: a far more compelling motivation to fight than mere monetary reward. Eger remained under Ottoman rule for 91 years. Temples were converted into mosques. The castle was rebuilt and strengthened by Turkish engineers. A minaret was erected that still stands today, the northernmost minaret ever built by the Ottoman Empire. In 1687, Eger was finally liberated by combined Austro-Hungarian forces, but the city was forever changed. A generation that grew up under Ottoman rule had different memories, different attachments, and different aspirations. So, did that 1,552 victory mean anything? If Eger still fell 44 years later, were those 39 days even important? The answer is yes, because 44 years in history is a significant period. It's 2 entire generations of people who grew up in freedom. It's 44 years during which revenue from the mines in Kassa funded Habsburg defense, not the Ottoman treasury. It's 44 years for Vienna to prepare for the sieges to come, and perhaps more importantly, it's 44 years during which Hungarians had their own story to tell. A story of how they stood firm. A story of how ordinary people became heroes. A story that no sultan could take away. Eger's strategic importance extended far beyond the fortress itself. The victory demonstrated that Ottoman expansion was not inevitable. Other fortresses, inspired by Eger's example, found the courage to resist. The psychological shift was colossal. From the belief that the Ottomans were invincible to the idea, the Ottomans can be defeated if you act smartly and never give up. This psychological shift influenced European military thinking for generations. Eger became a model in defensive warfare. Military theorists analyzed Dobó's tactics. Engineers studied castle fortifications. Commanders understood that numbers weren't everything. Preparation, leadership, and morale mattered far more. The story also became a cultural symbol of Hungarian identity. In the 19th century, as Hungary fought for its identity within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, writers and artists turned back to Eger as a symbol of Hungarian resilience. Gardonyi Géza's 1,899 novel Stars of Eger was not just historical fiction, it was a message to contemporary Hungarians. Look at what your ancestors achieved. You can do it too. The novel was adapted into a spectacular film in 1968. one of the most expensive films ever made in Hungary. It is still shown annually on Hungarian television. Every generation of Hungarian children grows up with this story. It shapes their understanding of their national character, not as victims of history, but as people who faced impossible odds and survived, and not just Hungarians. The story of Eger has inspired countless narratives of ordinary people facing insurmountable obstacles. It has shaped our understanding of defense, of courage, of what humans can achieve when they are united. But perhaps Eger's most important lesson is not about war. It's about how to face seemingly impossible challenges in our own lives. We all have moments when we face our own 40,000 Ottomans. Perhaps it's a medical diagnosis. Perhaps it's financial ruin. Perhaps it's personal loss. Perhaps it's simply the feeling that the world is too big and we are too small to make a difference. In those moments, remember Dobó. He didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he prepared better. He didn't win because he was fearless. He won because he did what was necessary despite his fear. Remember Bornemissza? He didn't have the weapons the Ottomans had, so he invented weapons they had never seen. When you can't compete with strength, compete with creativity. Remember the women of Eger? They weren't trained to fight, but they found ways to contribute. They turned everyday skills into tools of survival. You have skills you consider ordinary, but in the right context, they are extraordinary. And most importantly, remember that 2,000 men didn't defeat 40,000 because they were the strongest. They defeated them because they refused to surrender. To fight for 39 days straight, losing hundreds, watching walls crumble, hearing cannons constantly, and still keep fighting. That kind of courage can be found in anyone. It's not the courage of single heroic moments, but the courage of persistence, the courage to wake up every day and say, "Today, I will hold on for one more day," because that is how Eger was saved, not by one miraculous moment, but by 39 days of thousands of small choices, each saying, "We will not surrender." And if 2,000 men could hold out against 40,000 for 39 days, you can hold out against whatever you are facing today. So, back to the question I asked at the beginning. Was the victory at Eger a miracle, luck, or strategy? The answer is all three, but not as you might think. Yes, there was luck. Autumn came early. The Ottomans ran out of ammunition twice. Dysentery swept through their camp, and things like these were entirely beyond István Dobó's control. However, luck only favors those ready to seize it. If Dobó hadn't stockpiled enough food for 39 days, no amount of luck would have helped. If Bornemissza hadn't experimented with explosives, the bad weather wouldn't have been enough. If the civilians hadn't been organized into effective working teams, all the luck in the world wouldn't have saved Eger. And yes, there was strategy, but not the grand, genius strategy we imagine. Dobó wasn't Hannibal or Napoleon. His tactics were simple. Prepare for every small detail, utilize all available resources, and never give up. This is an approach anyone can learn. It's about diligence, patience, and executing small tasks correctly until they lead to something grand. But the most crucial factor, the one that turned a potential victory into a real one, cannot be gleaned from strategy books. The people understood something many commanders do not. In defense, morale is more important than weapons. You can have the thickest walls in the world, but if the defenders don't believe in the cause, those walls are useless. You can have the weakest walls, but if the defenders are willing to die for their beliefs, those walls become impregnable. Dobó achieved this by treating everyone, including civilians and women, as valuable participants. He didn't tell them to be quiet and let the real soldiers do their job. He said, "This is your task. It is important, and we need you." And the people responded, not because they were paid. Most weren't. Not because they thought they would survive. Most knew they would likely die. They responded because, for the first time, they felt part of something larger than themselves. This is the first lesson of Eger. Leadership isn't knowing all the answers. It's making people feel their contribution matters. The second lesson, innovation is born from desperation. Bornemissza didn't invent grenades and bombs because he was a genius. He invented them because he had no other choice. Faced with an enemy 20 times your size, you cannot fight as they do. You must find something they have never seen before. This is a lesson for anyone facing insurmountable tasks. Don't try to emulate those who are stronger than you. Find what you can do that they cannot. The third lesson, diversity is strength. The defenders of Eger were not uniform. They were professional soldiers, peasants, nobles, paupers, men and women, Lutherans and Catholics. In most armies of that era, this diversity would have been a weakness, but Dobó turned it into strength by giving everyone a role suited to their skills. Women weren't asked to fight with swords. They were asked to do what they already knew: to cook, but now to boil water as a weapon; to sew, but now to make powder bags and care; but now for the wounded. The German gunners did what they were trained to do. The Hungarian miners used their digging skills for countermines. This is a lesson for any organization. Don't try to make everyone fit the same mold. Find their unique strengths and cultivate them. The fourth lesson, perhaps the most important: some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. Bornemissza could have lived if he betrayed Eger's secrets, but he chose death. Why? Not because he wasn't afraid of death, but because he feared something greater than death: living as a traitor to his beliefs. When the Ottoman interrogators offered him his life in exchange for information, Bornemissza knew what his agreement would mean. Every future siege would use those secrets against Hungarian defenders. Every castle that fell because of his betrayal would be on his conscience. Every child enslaved, every woman captured, every man killed. All would be the result of his choice, valuing his own life over the lives of others. This is a lesson the modern world often forgets. Not everything can be compromised. There are principles worth fighting for, even at great sacrifice. And sometimes, standing firm, even when you lose, is more important than surviving through capitulation. Eger teaches us that victory isn't always about winning a battle. Sometimes, it's about creating a story from which future generations can learn valuable lessons. Today, 500 years later, we still tell the story of Eger. We still learn from Dobó, from Bornemissza, and from the women on the walls. It is a victory no sultan can take away. The lessons extend beyond individual bravery, touching on collective action. Eger demonstrates what happens when not just an army, but an entire community resists. The castle held not only due to brilliant command, it held because everyone, regardless of role or status, gave their utmost for a shared goal. This challenges our modern inclination towards individualism. We lionize the single hero, the lone genius, the unique leader, the outstanding warrior. But the truth of Eger is more complex and powerful. The victory came through 2,000 people doing unglamorous, grueling work, day after day, carrying stones, boiling water, standing watch, repairing walls, tending wounds, preparing food. These acts in themselves are not heroic, but collectively they gain heroic meaning. Consider what this means for modern challenges: climate change, political polarization, economic inequality. These problems feel insurmountable because we look for individual solutions or singular saviors, but Eger offers a different approach: collective effort. Everyone contributes, sustaining it over a long period, despite fatigue and doubt. The siege also demonstrates the limits of power. The Ottomans had everything: numerical superiority, weaponry, experience, resources. They should have won easily. Their defeat shows that brute force, lacking flexibility, understanding of the opponent, and maintaining morale, is ultimately doomed to fail. This impacts our thinking about conflicts at any level. In business, giant corporations with limitless resources sometimes lose to small startups because size breeds inflexibility. In politics, powerful movements crumble when they lose touch with why people initially believed in them. In our personal lives, we often try to crush problems with effort, ignoring whether we are using the right approach. Dobó's genius lay not in having more resources, but in perfectly utilizing limited ones. He couldn't match Ottoman firepower, so he focused on preparation, morale, and inventive tactics. If you cannot win with superior force, win with superior effectiveness. Finally, Eger teaches us about the interconnectedness of physical and psychological warfare. The castle's physical fortifications certainly mattered, but what ultimately stopped the Ottoman siege was not the strength of the walls. It was the psychological impossibility of victory that became apparent to the attackers. The Ottomans could have continued. They still had numerical superiority, but they had lost faith. Once soldiers began telling stories of supernatural defenders and magical blood, the siege had effectively ended. The physical battle continued, but the psychological battle had been lost. This reveals something profound. Belief shapes outcomes as much as material conditions. The defenders believed they could hold for one more day, and they did. The attackers stopped believing they could win, and therefore they couldn't. The same battlefield, the same weapons, but different beliefs lead to different outcomes. In your own trials, this is critically important. Objective conditions matter, but your belief in those conditions can matter more. If you believe a problem is insurmountable, you will approach it with less enthusiasm and prove yourself right. If you believe solutions exist, you will seek them until you find them. The deepest lesson, Eger, is not about medieval siege warfare. It is about human potential when people unite around a common purpose, refuse to accept defeat, and maintain faith even when logic dictates hopelessness. This is why this story resonates 5 centuries later, because we all face our own sieges, and we all need to be reminded that the impossible becomes possible when ordinary people, together, achieve extraordinary things. Today, you can still visit Eger Castle. The walls still stand, rebuilt, reinforced, but the same walls that Dobó defended. You can walk along the bastions where Bornemissza hurled his grenades. You can look down from the shrine bastion where Dobó stood and ordered cannons fired at the old gate. And if you listen, every day at 3:52 p.m., a cannon shot rings out. This is how Eger remembers daily. At the same hour the siege began in 1552. A shot is fired, reminding everyone of what happened here. In town, you can buy Eger Bikaver, bull's blood. It's a strong red wine that, according to legend, gave Hungarian soldiers superhuman strength. The legend, of course, is not true, but the truth behind it is real. The wine gave frightened men a moment of courage, and sometimes, a moment is all you need. The story of Eger has been retold for hundreds of years. Poet Sebastian Tinadel Antal wrote about it shortly after the siege. Mihaly Vörösmarty wrote an epic poem in 1827, but the most famous version is Gardonyi Géza's novel, Stars of Eger, published in 1899. This book was more than historical fiction. It was written when Hungary was searching for its identity within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Gardonyi told his readers, "Look at what your ancestors accomplished. They stood firm when all seemed hopeless. You can too." In 1968, the novel became a spectacular film, one of the most expensive in Hungarian history. It is still shown annually on Hungarian television. Every generation of Hungarian children grows up with this story, and not just in Hungary. The story of Eger has inspired countless narratives of ordinary people facing impossible odds. It has shaped our understanding of defense, of courage, of what humans can achieve when united. But perhaps Eger's most important lesson is not about war. It's about confronting seemingly insurmountable challenges in your own life. We all have moments when we face our own 40,000 Ottomans. Perhaps it's a serious medical diagnosis. Perhaps it's financial ruin, or maybe personal loss. Perhaps it's simply the feeling that the world is too big, and you are too insignificant to make a difference. In those moments, remember Dobó. He didn't win because he was stronger. He won through better preparation. He didn't win due to a lack of fear. He won because he did what was necessary, despite it. Remember Bornemissza? He didn't have the weapons the Turks had, so he created something entirely new. If you cannot compete with strength, compete with ingenuity. Remember the women of Eger. They weren't trained to fight, but they found ways to contribute. They turned everyday skills into tools of survival. You have skills you consider ordinary, but in the right context, they can be extraordinary. And most importantly, remember that 2,000 men defeated 40,000 not because they were the strongest. They defeated them because they refused to surrender, to fight for 39 days straight, losing hundreds of warriors, watching walls crumble, hearing the continuous roar of cannons, and still resist. This kind of courage is available to everyone. It is not the courage of single heroic acts, but the courage of persistence. The courage to wake up every day and say, "Today, I will hold on for one more day." For that is how Eger was saved, not by one miraculous moment, but by 39 days of thousands of small choices, each one saying, "We will not give up." And if 2,000 men could withstand 40,000 for 39 days, then you can withstand whatever you are facing today. So, when you face your challenge, whatever it may be, ask yourself, what would Dobó do? How would I prepare? What resources would I use? Where would I find the strength? And then, act day by day, decision by decision, one small act of courage at a time. because that is how Eger was saved, not by one magical moment, but by 39 days of thousands of small choices, each saying, "We will not retreat." And if 2,000 men held out against 40,000 for 39 days, then you can stand against any hardship. This is the message of Eger. This is why we retell this story 5 centuries later. And this is why, every day at 3:52 p.m. in Eger, a cannon fires, reminding us that the impossible remains so, until someone makes it possible. If this story inspired you, leave a comment sharing what seemingly impossible challenges you are facing in your life. Let this community support each other, just as the people of Eger supported each other on those walls in 1552. Subscribe so you don't miss other historical stories of courage, strategy, and people overcoming unimaginable obstacles. And if you wish, share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are stronger than they think. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, history is not just what happened, it is also what we learn to do better. Based on this story, please adapt the story into English, without changing the core content, in standard, complete, and grammatically correct English, without omitting content, the length of the adaptation being equivalent to the original, with all content, no summaries.